29, where are we at? 9 o'clock. All right. I say we can go ahead and get started. Today, um, you have me as your guest speaker. So, it's been a little while since I've been the presenter, but I'm going to go over some broker call scenarios. This is usually a pretty popular topic. And feel free to ask questions in the chat. Raise your hand if you want to ask something live, or if you got a scenario that you want to type in the chat, we can probably go over that as well. Um, so what I do basically, I'm not naming anybody's names here. No one's getting thrown under the bus or made fun of or anything like that. This is just kind of everyday calls that I get from the team, and some of them are kind of intricate, some of them are not so much. But I wanted to go over, they're good learning moments, really. So I like to share them. And then I'm going to share, parts of the contract that refer to these scenarios and different things like that. So some of these I've gone over before. We have lots of new ones in here as well. I usually do this 2, 3 times a year for those of you that are new to the team. So before we get started, though, we have Paul with the Monday update from Tried and True Home Loans. Paul, how's it going?
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so let me share my screen real quick. Mm,
Do you need me to unshare mine?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Okay, here we go. Let me go. Um,
Might be a new setting in there. It's been
okay.
doing that for some reason.
um,
You have the share function. There you go.
Okay, these are one of the number one questions that I get and that are very misleading and very confusing. So I thought I'd just put the fire out and just kind of like put it out there. So what is the difference between a mortgage interest rate and the APR, which is called the annual percentage rate? The mortgage interest rate and the APR, also known as annual percentage rate, are both important factors when taking out a mortgage, but they represent different aspects of the loan cost. Most consumers and most professionals think that the APR is the actual interest rate, and it is not. There's a hang on a minute. Well, the actual number one mortgage interest rate. This is a percentage charged on the loan principal, the amount you borrowed by the lender for the use of their money. It directly impacts your monthly payment and the total amount you'll pay over the life of the loan. It is the base rate used to calculate your monthly mortgage payment. Now, number two, the APR, annual percentage rate. This is the percentage charged on the loan principal, the amount you borrowed by the lender. Um, I just realized there's an error on this thing. So number two is supposed to be all the fees and charges that incorporates into the um, kind of like a guard. So when you're actually, okay, this is a better example. The APR gives you the total cost of the loan, including additional fees and charges. So it's usually higher than the interest rate. So the example I want to give you, I'm just going to give you a broad example. Say the interest rate is 6%, and then you see the APR 6.25 or 6.5, or maybe 7%. Okay, the actual interest rate is correct, 6%. But when you see the APR much higher, that's telling you the fees that are incorporated, the potential fees that are incorporated into that loan. So if you see 6.25, that's decent, right? The loan costs and fees are decent. You start seeing 6.5 and 7%, then you start questioning, gee, what are the fees incorporated with that loan? Why is it so much higher? There's going to be um, there's going to be a lot of reason to that. So when you're comparing mortgages, the APR is often a better gauge of the loan true cost, and it accounts for those extra fees that the interest rate doesn't reflect. So if you're shopping for a loan, you're shopping for Zillow mortgage, you're shopping Citibank, Caliber, Chase, and you name it. And you see 6.25, 6.5, 7. In some cases, you're going to see the interest rate at 6, and maybe 7.5%, you're wondering what are the costs into that loan, and that just tells you that the fees are higher. So here's an example. These are the rates and APR as of Friday. I didn't get into it today. So as of Friday, the average, not anything specific, the average 30-year fix, 6.460. Okay. Um, Rates are trickling down. However, the APR, the average APR is 6.541. That, you're talking credit report, you're talking any origination fee, maybe discount points, somebody escrow charges. There's hit and miss. It's not a complete cost list for the APR, but it's giving you all the base stuff. This APR does not include impound account, does not include property taxes and fire insurance. Just keep that in mind. And then as you get down to the bottom, you'll see a 30-year fixed rate FHA is 6.196. Now, I'm going to stop you right there. You see the APR showed is 7.013. Why is FHA much higher when the actual interest rate is much lower? Consumers get that confused. Okay, there's a fee in there called the mortgage insurance premium, not the monthly fee. FHA had two separate fees. You got the monthly PMI, and then you have the fee that is built on top of the loan, either built on top of the loan, or you pay cash, the borrower pays cash and not have it financed. So this 7.013 is indicating that FHA premium is going to be paid by the borrower, whether the borrower pays it cash out of the pocket, usually $2,000-3,000, depending on the loan amount. I'm just giving you like an average amount, or it can be financed. Now, let's just say anytime you see a 30-year fixed rate FHA at 6.196, and you see the APR similar to the APR with the 30-year fixed APR, that simply means somebody paying for it, not the borrower. It could be maybe the seller paying for it. Because if somebody else is paying for it and not the borrower, that changes the APR. Believe it or not, it does. So you want to definitely keep that in mind. Any discussions, questions? Feel free to reach out to me via email, my phone number, my text. I know this is a very confusing subject, but I feel that it is really important to educate our consumers and our realtors and people in the profession in regards to this, because it can be very misleading if another broker tells you, hey, I'm going to offer you 4.9 interest rate, and you see that APR is substantially much higher and the consumer doesn't understand it or oversees it or misses it, they might miss the beat.
All right, good info. We've got a couple questions in the chat and a question in the Q&A section and what as well. If you want to grab those
Sure.
while I go
Okay,
ahead
so
and
the
get started.
first one, add cost to rate, good comparison number. Does the APR include a PMI, MIP? Yes. I was just explaining the FHA, if you recall, I had on there was like a 6.196% interest rate. Then the APR shows a 7. That's the APR. That's for the APR if the MIP incorporated into the loan or the borrower paying for it. Now, if the seller is paying for it or somebody else, a realtor or whatever, it doesn't go in there. For some reason, it's not in there. So it's something to keep an eye on for when it comes to that. Perfect. Okay, I will go ahead
Yep,
and put my contact information in the chat box. Guys and gals, thank you very much. Have a great day.
awesome. Thanks a lot for coming on. All right, so here we go. We're gonna go for some broker scenarios. I got quite a few of them today that we can run through. Again, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. Feel free to discuss as well as we kind of go along. I don't have a pretty slideshow. It's I kind of throw them down on a Google Doc and just go through it that way. It's just a little easier for me, and it's easier for me to throw in the clips from the actual forms that I'm going to be referencing. So here we go. First scenario. Seller sent us a counter offer, but then accepted another offer without notifying us before we responded. Can they do that? And the answer is yes. So at any time during the offer counter offer stage, the seller can accept a competing offer without notice. We have to keep in mind that time is of the essence. We all hear that quite often in this business, and this is a prime example. So you will see right here that it says, so we're looking at an offer and or counter offer. So it's going to be the same on either one. It says, um, or if seller accepts another offer prior to buyer's acceptance of this offer. So, and below that, marketing to other buyers. Seller has the right to continue to offer the property for sale. Seller has a right to accept any other offer received prior to acceptance of this counter offer by buyer as specified in 2A and 5. In such event, seller is advised to withdraw seller counter offer before accepting another offer. So you see there that it says advised. It doesn't mean shall. They don't have to. So, if you have a counter offer out, um, or if there are multiple counter offers out, just know that it's not first come, first serve. The seller can receive another offer and accept it right there on the spot without notifying. All right, next one. The listing agent slash seller let our offer expire and did not respond. What can I do? This is kind of a common one, unfortunately. And what we're looking at here is the RPA, paragraph 33, says seller has no obligation to respond to an offer made. So 33A right here in bold, seller has no obligation to respond to the offer. So does the agent have to present it? Yes. But does the seller have to send a response? They do not. Um, the expiration date slash time of an offer counter offer only relates to the amount of time the offer slash counter offer is in effect. So by default, that's 3 days of the contract. That means that offer is a bona fide valid offer that you sent or counter offer for the time allotted that you put in there. Like I said, default is 3 days. So it has nothing to do with when the seller has to respond. They don't have to. So we'll do an example here. If a buyer makes an offer on a property and the seller does not respond prior to the expiration date, then after that expiration date, the buyer would no longer be obligated to the terms of that offer and can offer on additional properties without concern. Even if the seller responded with an acceptance after the expiration date, the buyer would not be obligated to move forward. Same goes for counteroffers. So let's say you make an offer on the property, seller's kind of kicking it around. Maybe they have another offer they think is coming in, and they're kind of putting you off and not responding. And then all of a sudden, after 4 days, you have an acceptance, just straight up acceptance in your inbox. Technically, the buyer is not bound to that. They could be, they can decide to work with that, but they don't have to. They are not bound to it at that point. Now, the new forms do have a late acceptance in there, exactly for this reason, where the buyer would then again sign the bottom saying, we accept this late acceptance and want to move forward. So they did add that on the last forms rollout. Um, Now, what do you do if you suspect that your offer was not presented? Here are some things you can do. Document the date and time and method used to deliver the offer to the listing agent and any follow-up efforts on the status of the offer. Consider contacting the broker or the listing agent. Consider sending the listing agent one of car sample letters. Demand that the offer be presented to seller. Request to participate in presentation of offer, or request for listing broker's written confirmation that offer has been presented. Those sample letters are found in zip forms, Lone Wolf, whatever you want to call it, our forms library. There's a bunch of sample letters in there, but you can use any one of those. Again, you notice that all of those say request and not demand or anything like that. So it gets a little tricky with that. Can you legally deliver the offer directly to the seller? NAR Code of Ethics, Standard Practice 1613 states that dealing with a seller who is subject to an exclusive agreement must be carried on with the seller's agent or broker, except with consent of the agent or when initiated by the seller. However, Model MLS Rule 9.1 allows for direct negotiations if after reasonable effort and no less than 1 day, the buyer's broker cannot contact the listing broker. But the listing broker may preclude such direct negotiations by giving notice through MLS. So contact your MLS for details regarding 9.1. And those are unfortunate situations when you're not sure if your offer got accepted and things like that. But those are some things you can do. Those are straight from Car Legal. This one comes in. Actually, let me check the chat real quick. Looks like we might have a couple questions. On the RPA, there is a space below the signature stating broker or seller initials and time the offer. That is correct. Even then, sometimes the brokers or the listing agents are not doing that. They're not sending it back, playing games, whatever it is. So the above that I just went through, you can go through those steps and try and at least get that portion of the contract initialed so that you can show that the buyer's offer was, at least presented. Again, sometimes they'll just go ahead and initial it. It's hard to tell what the other agent's doing. So can a real estate licensee pay a referral fee or a fee to an unlicensed person? The answer is no. If the resulting transaction falls under RESPA, we've all heard of RESPA. Yes, if it doesn't fall under RESPA. So a real estate agent may give someone a token of appreciation after receiving a referral. A real estate agent may give a commission rebate to his or her client. Commission rebate is generally done through escrow. You would instruct escrow to say, hey, I'm rebating X% or X dollar amount from my commission to the buyer to go towards their closing costs. Perfectly legal, totally fine, happens every day. So what are non-RESPA transactions? Commercial property, residential property with 5 or more units, agricultural property, vacant land, basically any property other than residential 1 to 4 unit property, or a transaction not involving a federally regulated mortgage loan, such as a private one-time lender or an all-cash deal. So those would be non-RESPA transactions. California law allows a real estate agent to pay a referral fee to an unlicensed person for merely introducing a new client for these types of sales, the exclusions. If, however, the unlicensed person goes beyond arranging an introduction, such as negotiating the terms of a sale on behalf of a principal, the real estate agent may not compensate the unlicensed person for performing licensed acts. So, be sure that you're following these pretty strictly and you're really looking at that if you're falling into this scenario. So this one comes up quite a bit, and on the last forms rollout in December, they did change up the RLA. Actually, it might have been the rollout before that, but definitely the one in December where they added in the extra MLSA form for this specific topic here. So I just took a listing. My seller doesn't want to put it on the market for another week. What do I do? Listings need to be inputted into MLS no more than 24 hours after the beginning date in section 2A1 of the RLA per MLS rules. So this is the terms of the listing agreement. We're on section 1, basically the very top line here in the RLA. And this is the beginning date. So you need to have a beginning and end date all the time. Otherwise, this is unenforceable. You must have both dates in there. But technically, this date right here, 3/10, I would need to have this home on the market today or tomorrow at the latest by end of day in MLS. This would be the MLS rules. If your listing is not a coming soon listing and is to be input in the MLS on a later date, you will need to mark the on market date in the MSLA paragraph 3D2, which is part of the RLA bundle. So you'll have the agency form AD, then you'll have the RLA, the residential listing agreement, and then the next form after that in the listing bundle is the MLSA. This is a snippet from that. Basically, they kind of just snipped out a lot of portions of the old RLA format and put it into this addendum, this MLS addendum, MLSA. So you'll put right here, we're in 3D2 right here. It says seller instructs broker to exclude the property from decimation by the MLS. The MLS may require its own form, yada, yada. You'll click A, that we want this to begin marketing on a future date, 3/21. So what you have just created here is a binding contract starting today that seller and agent are agreeing to, be employed and to get this home listed and on the market. So we have an agreement, but we're not putting it on the market yet. So we have an agreement that we have a binding listing agreement, but not to be marketed until a couple weeks later on 3/21. So that's when it needs to be put into the MLS. Maybe you're waiting for pictures, doing some renovations, some cleanup, whatever the story is. To go beyond that a little bit, let's say repairs and stuff are taking a little longer than needed, and you need to push this out another week, you would just use Form MT, modification of terms, and just make that on market date 1 week later or whatever it's going to be. So this can be adjusted, but this is how you would start the listing agreement. Let's say, I don't know, maybe buyer and seller have already kind of come to terms. They want you to do the paperwork and you need a listing agreement in place so that you can get compensated. And it's going to be off market the entire time, not on the MLS. If your listings be sold off market from MLS, you'll need a SELM signed by the sellers or paragraph 7D2. It's going to be right here. So instead of A, you're going to click B and not to market the property to the public during the listing period unless seller gives written instruction otherwise. All right. Grabbing chat real quick. Yeah, I usually put the copy of this document in the recording in our Facebook group so that you can grab it. And a little further down, I do have some links in here. So it would be that's where you'll find it. If you need it, if you're not part of the Rise Realty Facebook group, then let us know and shoot us an email and Roxanne can send this over to you. So question, when you refer to the RPA date for an addendum or some other required document and you have to identify the RPA, what date do you put on there? That'll be the start date of the listing agreement, not the on-market date. So it'll be the document date up top. Well, actually, it'll be the signature when it was agreed to. So yes, you're not referencing the on-market date. You're referencing just like with the RPA. When you would count days from escrow, it would be when the listing agreement was agreed to by all parties. Okay, buyer not making any repair requests. Do I still fill out the RR? You don't have to, it's not a requirement, but I do recommend doing it. I'm going to show you why. So it is good practice to have record of the buyer making no requests for repairs or credits. Simply type into section 1 of the RR, which is a request for repairs, this verbiage or similar. So you'll just, we're looking at a snippet here from the RR. A buyer request, check all that apply. Buyer request, seller make the seller prior to final BP of condition, repair, take specified action, blah, blah, blah. You're just going to put in here, buyer makes no request for repairs, credits, or price adjustments. Everybody sign it. So now it's on record that your buyer is not making any repair requests. And this is for everybody's, I guess if you want to call it protection. So it's for you as the buyer's agent. So they can't say, you didn't tell me I could make repair requests or ask for credits after the home inspection. And now we have a problem. Right here, you're putting it on record that they are making no repair requests. This will create a more formal paper trail with the buyer that they did not make a request. Additionally, which I like the most, is there's a release in 4B of the RR form that is a good addition to your transactional risk management practices. And you'll see 4B down here. Buyer releases seller from any loss, liability, expense, claim, or cause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property. So, we want to see that kind of stuff. Next up, so this topic comes up quite a bit actually. So my buyer made a request for repairs, but the seller's not responding. What do I do? To start, it's good practice for a listing agent to have the seller formally reject any request for repairs, car form RR, they are not willing to entertain. If you're a listing agent, just, I don't see the point in playing the game. Just have them reject it and move on. That way there's no discrepancy on did it get presented and all this other stuff. And, all it does is make the other party angry when you're not getting responses. However, just as a seller is not legally required to respond to an offer, a seller is also not required to respond to a request for repairs or amendment. Paragraph 14B2 of the RPA states this, and we're looking at a snippet from the RPA. And you'll see right here in 14B2, seller has no obligation to agree or to respond to buyer's request form RR or the 4R. So it says right in the RPA that, again, they have no obligation to even respond to your request. That's why it's called a request. And let's take this a little further. In this case, the buyer is still required to perform on the contract regarding timelines to remove contingencies, and the seller may choose to send a notice to perform. Should the buyer not remove the applicable contingencies, the seller may cancel per the terms of the notice to perform, car form NBP. The request for repairs does not extend the investigation's timeline per the terms of the RPA in any way. So if you have a 10-day investigations contingency in your RPA and you do your inspections on day 8 and you send your request for repairs on day 10 and thinking that it's going to buy you a little bit more time, technically it doesn't. Technically, by contract, the buyer should be releasing contingencies on day 10, and the seller can send a notice to perform. They can send a notice to perform in lieu of a response to the request for repairs, just depending on how that agent does business. So they can actually send a notice to perform a couple days prior, so that on day 10 of when you should be releasing the contingencies, if you have not, they've already sent the notice to perform and let it season, and they could cancel on you right there on day 10 if you have not released them. So that all depends on how aggressive the listing agent is. But hopefully that clears up a little some questions there. I'm gonna go into the chat real quick. So, although the seller does not have to respond to buyer's form RR, but if the seller does stuff to the house that was on the RR list without replying to the RR, does this leave the window open, allowing the buyer the right to ask for additional property condition or inspections or investigations for condition items? You know, I guess that they can repair those items, but I I technically wouldn't without having some sort of agreement or something, because now they've changed what they've disclosed in their seller disclosures. So I don't really recommend them doing that. Technically, they should probably redisclose because now they've made alterations to the property per the TDS or SPQ, and those weren't agreed upon. So, especially if they're making changes to stuff that the buyer didn't even ask for things to be changed. So I don't think that I would really do that if I was on the seller side. So in your scenario, the seller did termite, but didn't respond and didn't redisclose. Well, they need to provide the report for one thing. So, and I have that a little further down as well. Seller has SIP in place. When does the timeline start? And we had one of our listing agents kind of fudge this a little bit, and they counted their days wrong on the SIP, and the buyers are pretty upset because they thought they were going to be moving in on a certain date, and lo and behold, the seller still had another right to be there. It had a right to be there for one more day because they didn't count the days right, and they told the buyer incorrect information. So you have an SIP in place. When does the timeline start? Close of escrow is day zero, just like the acceptance of contract and, you know, counting your days with that. So the next day would be day one. So let's say we close escrow today. Today is day zero for SIP purposes. Tomorrow will be day one, following day, day two, and so on and so forth. So that's how you count the days on there. And I guess I didn't put where this is at, but this is in the RPA right here. Uh, Paragraph I, counting days. And you'll see right here, number 6, close of escrow is considered day zero for purposes of counting days. Seller is allowed to remain in possession if permitted by this agreement. So states it in the RPA. Close of escrow date has passed, and now the buyer wants to cancel. Can we keep their earnest money? So you're in contract and you're, past close of escrow date, and now the buyer's like, I want to cancel. Um, what do we do? Can the seller keep their earnest money now? And that really depends. So my first question back to you is always going to be, are all of the contingencies released? If they are released, then yes, they could be entitled to the earnest money. The seller could be entitled to the earnest money. If there are contingencies in place still, the buyer may have a legal way to cancel, even if they are past the close of escrow date. And this is why it's so important as a listing agent to make sure you're chipping away at the contingencies as you move through the contract, because you don't want to get, a couple days from escrow, uh, closing, closing date, or even beyond that, and still have a buyer investigation contingency in place or something that the buyer could technically still exercise. So, very, very important if you're the listing agent. That is, you know, a very high priority for you to be performing as their representative. So it's your responsibility and duty to the client as a listing agent to make sure the buyer is performing on all aspects of the contract. Contingencies must be physically removed no sooner than the date of performance in the contract. Always use CAR form CR to do this. Don't have anything verbal, use the form. Chip away at contingency releases throughout the escrow period according to the contract timelines. use the notice to perform when necessary, because using the notice to perform gives the seller the option to cancel if they want. They don't have to, but it does put pressure on the buyer, and it puts the seller in a position where, if they've sent the notice to perform and the buyer still has not, after the third day, fourth day, fifth day, and the seller's just fed up, boom, cancellation. Now they've already let it season. They don't have to wait more days to let the notice to perform season and then cancel. So keep that leverage. If buyers are refusing to release contingencies per timelines and the seller has fully performed, deliver notice to perform to maintain leverage. If a buyer needs an extension of time, get something in exchange. This is something that I always do. And what would that be? Either partial or full earnest money release to the seller, or a per diem charge agreed to, or both. I prefer the EMD release personally. This way, if the buyer ends up defaulting or canceling later in the escrow period, the earnest money has already been released and there is little or no monetary dispute to resolve. So, let's say you're into the contract, it's coming up on 30 days. Buyer's like, hey, I need another week or 2 weeks or something like that. Sure, no problem. I'm going to need you to release some earnest money in exchange for some time. Otherwise, I'm going to send you either a demand to close or a notice to perform, probably a demand to close. We're going to go ahead and cancel on you and move on to the next buyer. So why do you want to do that? Is because if you don't get the earnest money and you just sign the extension, you're like, yep, no problem. Here's 2 more weeks. And 2 weeks comes along. Now you're 50 days into your escrow, and now this buyer still is not performing and asking for more time, or they still have their loan contingency in place and decide to go ahead and cancel. Well, the seller's probably going to be pretty upset, that they have gone 50 days into the contract and no no money for damages. They may have moved out of the house. Um, who knows, whatever their scenario is. But if you have, or maybe the buyer has released all the contingencies and now they can't perform, and um, you're 50 days in and they have to cancel, and we all know that the earnest money, that the seller would be or could be entitled to that earnest money at that point because all the contingencies have been released. But you have to remember, it takes both parties to release earnest money. So it takes one party to cancel, and then it takes two parties, the buyer and the seller, to agree as to the disposition of the earnest money that's being held. So the seller may say, I'm not signing, I'm not signing, I'm not signing. And, uh, you know, the buyer, they're gonna have to go to mediation or something like that. And technically the buyer, is in the wrong in that scenario, but now you're fighting over the earnest money in mediation when you could have just gotten it 2 weeks ago, in exchange for that extra time. So that's why I do it, because I don't want to get to the cancellation and have to dispute and fight over the earnest money, whether you're right or wrong. Yeah, I just take that out of the equation. So when I say get something in exchange, that's why I do that. The per diem, some agents like to do the per diem. Problem with the per diem is, again, let's say you have, $100 per day per diem in there, and for every day they don't close, now you're 2 weeks, past close of escrow date, and the seller's like, oh, cool, I can get this per diem at close of escrow, and then close of escrow doesn't happen. Um, Now you got to fight for the per diem as well as the earnest money potentially. So the other problem with it is sometimes the buyer is really, really tight on funds, and adding on another 700, another $1,400 in closing costs could literally prevent them from closing the house. So personally, I would rather have the earnest money, just so my seller has already um, essentially retained their liquidated damages in the event that this sale is gonna fail. So I don't know what your guys' best practices are, but that's been mine for a number of years. So we have a question. Can you insert language into the seller's SCO to make removal of contingencies a passive event? Lately, buyer's agents tend to delay sending the CR forms, especially when they have some issues behind the scene they are not fully disclosing. And that answer is yes. You can say that the buyer's contingencies are to be automatically removed on whatever date. So yes, you can say that, and you can go beyond and say earnest money to be deemed non-refundable. Again, it takes two to release that earnest money, but it is very strong language. And yes, you can make it to where it is automatic because it is not by contract, just to be clear on that. You have to physically remove them on the date. But if there's language in there, and I've seen that, it's pretty rare, but I've seen a couple pretty aggressive listing agents put that in there, that they're to be automatically removed on the dates per the contract. The appraiser conditioned for repairs on FHA appraisal. Who pays for these repairs? What happens if the seller refuses to make the repairs? All right, so paragraph 5C4 pertains to FHA VA offers. So we're looking at it right here. Number 4, FHA VA. If FHA or VA is checked in paragraph 3E1, FHA VA mandatory clause shall be incorporated and signed by all parties. Buyer shall, within time specified, deliver to seller written notice, RR, so the request for repairs or an amendment, AEA, of any lender requirements that buyer requests seller to pay for or otherwise correct, or that there is no lender requirements. Notwithstanding seller's agreement that the buyer may obtain FHA or VA financing, seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy any or all lender requirements unless agreed to in writing. So what you're reading there, looks like no, it's right. You can see from this section that it states buyer shall, within the time specified in 3E1, deliver to seller written notice of any lender requirements that the buyer requests the seller to pay. So, and this is E1, so this is in the grid section here. So in the loan amounts, so we're looking at page 1 of the RPA. If FHA or VA checked, deliver a list of lender required repairs within this date right here, which is default 17 days. Now, can also see from this paragraph that the seller has no obligation to pay for or correct any lender appraisal requirements for the home to qualify for FHA or VA financing. They are merely agreeing that the buyer may use that type of financing, but they're not saying that they're going to fix anything. So, and we're looking again at the RPA. It says right here, C4, seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy any lender requirements unless agreed in writing. So, how do you fix this? How do you protect your buyer and make sure that this deal is going to go through? Well, get it agreed to up front. If you have a concern that the seller may not agree to correct lender appraisal requirements, then this should be addressed in the original offer or counteroffer. This will bind the seller to make these corrections if required. You have to use, or you can use section G2 of the grid and the RPA. So this is additional seller credit terms. Seller agrees to correct at the seller's expense any lender and or appraisal conditions required for FHA loan funding. So you can, attempt or make an agreement up front that the seller is agreeing up front to make these repairs. On the flip side, if you're on the listing side, okay, well, I don't know if I want to do that, or maybe I want to put a cap on that amount because just like with the termite inspection, if you're agreeing up front as a seller to pay for a Section 1 clearance and you haven't even had uh, a report on the house yet, you're agreeing to an unknown amount. I've seen termite Section 1 clearances come back at $35,000. So you don't want to bind your seller to this unknown amount. Same thing with the FHA, VA repairs. I mean, it might be something small. They might call out all kinds of painting and all kinds of other stuff that can get very expensive. So, you might want to put a cap on that amount or counter that out if, you're on the listing side. But also you do want the deal to go through. So, I guess treat your scenario accordingly. A couple questions on where to watch a recording. Recording is on YouTube. Rise Realty CA is our channel. It's in the back office on the homepage, riserealtyoffice.com, and it'll be in the Facebook group by the end of today. If a buyer is making a FHA non-contingent offer and removes those on a CB1 with the buyer's RPA, including appraisal contingency, can the buyer remove their own protective language that is in the FHA VA clause? That's a good question. I have to look at that. I think that's for VA, I'm not sure. And actually, I think Andrew's in here. You might be able to pipe in on the VA part. There's some things that just can't happen, especially on VA. So I'll have to look that up. Let's see. Next one. I'll speed it up just a little bit. So the home did not appraise, the buyer is canceling. The listing agent asked for a copy of the appraisal. Do you have to provide it? Answer is yes, you do in that instance. If the buyer is exercising their right to cancel based on the appraisal contingency, then they must provide a copy of the appraisal request. 8B1 of the RPA states this. We're looking at the appraisal contingency right here. For any cancellation based on the appraisal contingency, buyer shall deliver a copy of the written appraisal to the seller upon request. If the home appraises, and there's no issue with it, no conditions or anything else, then the buyer does not need to provide, only if they're exercising their right to cancel. Home did not appraise, and we've waived the appraisal contingency up front. Can the buyer use the loan contingency to cancel since they won't have enough money to close now? And I have seen agents try this tactic, and I do not recommend it. Section 8B2 of the RPA covers this scenario, and the answer is no. If a buyer is wanting to waive the appraisal up front with thoughts that they can use the loan contingency to cancel, refer them to this section of the RPA, and we're in B2. Well, it's 8B2, no appraisal contingency. Says buyer may not use the loan contingency specified in paragraph 3L1 to cancel this agreement if the sole reason is for not obtaining the loan is that the appraisal relied upon by the buyer's lender values the property at an amount less than the specified. So if buyer is unable to obtain loan specified solely for this reason, seller may be entitled to buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. So it clearly states in the RPA that you cannot use this the loan contingency for a short appraisal. So I do not recommend doing that. We waived our appraisal contingency, but not our investigations contingency. Can we use investigations contingency to cancel if the home does not appraise? I also see this used quite often. I advise against this tactic as the EMD can be disputed by the listing agent and seller. The reason is due to paragraph 14 of the RPA clearly and boldly states that a cancellation based on contingencies must be exercised in good faith. So if using the investigations contingency to cancel based on a low appraisal would not be canceling in good faith, and you may end up in an earnest money dispute. Additionally, if you advised your buyer to do this and you told them they can get their earnest money back because you will just use the investigations contingency to back out could land you in hot water too with your client as well, if they get caught up in an EMD dispute. Contingencies are not interchangeable with one another. So they always need to be in good faith according to the contract. Now we're looking at section 14 right here of the RPA, time periods, removal of contingencies, cancellation rights. Following time periods may only be extended, altered, modified, or changed by mutual written agreement. Any removal of contingencies or cancellation under this paragraph by either buyer or seller must be exercised in good faith and in writing. So if you're using that tactic as a buyer's agent and the listing agent calls you out on it, you might find yourself in an earnest money dispute. And if it goes further, the buyer may lose their earnest money, even though they had a contingent, investigations contingency still in place, because they are not interchangeable. And Andrew did pipe in on the FVAC form question, if you want to check in on that on the chat. All right, buyer did not remove their contingencies after we provided them with notice to perform. Can we cancel the sale and retain their earnest money? Per 14C of the RPA, the answer is most likely no. 14C of the RPA clearly states that should the seller cancel the sale after first delivering notice to perform, they shall authorize the return of the buyer's EMD. And you remember from our webinar a few weeks ago with the attorney from Property ID, she used that word shall and basically stated that is the strongest language in the contract, shall, meaning it has to be. So this is stating seller shall return. This also applies to contract obligations such as a buyer not providing updated lender contact, delivery of FHA/VA cost or terms, delivery of pre-approval letter or proof of funds. And on that note, why do we ask for the proof of funds and or pre-approval letter in our transaction files? Because they're actually part of the contract. So that is why we ask for them in paperless pipeline. So if you are just like, oh, I don't need that or whatever, it's actually part of the contract. So we need that in there. Well, side note, return of statutory and or other disclosures or any other contractual obligations. So yes, it states in here, we're on C1, seller right to cancel, buyer contingencies. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit except fees incurred by the buyer. And also seller right to cancel buyer contract obligations. So there's contingencies and there's obligations. Same thing, seller shall authorize a return of the buyer's deposit. So a lot of misconceptions out there with homeowners. Maybe they, it's been a while since they've sold a home. Maybe they sold homes in other states where that is different. I have sold real estate in other states. I've been licensed in other states, and it is different. Contingencies, when they end, they end. And buyer's earnest money goes hard. So it is not like that here in California. So you need to advise them that no, they cannot retain it. By canceling, you're agreeing to return their earnest money in most scenarios. So there could be something, but my buyer wants to make a non-contingent offer. Is this risky? Yes, of course. Absolutely. The buyer may be at risk of losing their earnest money or paying other damages if the buyer decides not to purchase after the offer is accepted, because there may be no contractual rights to cancel the contract, even if the buyer decides to cancel before they deposit their earnest money. This risk needs to be carefully balanced against the risk of having an offer with no contingencies rejected. Use CAR form NCOA for all waived contingencies. If you're making a non-contingent offer, if you're waiving any contingencies up front, you have to put in the NCOA, and that is an advisory, basically stating that we're advising against this, and we need to say that, as real estate agents to the clients. So does a buyer have any rights to cancel a contract without any contingencies? Well, technically, yes. TDS law states that if the buyer is provided a real estate transfer disclosure statement after the buyer submits the offer, or the TDS is updated or modified during the transaction, there is a statutory right to cancel the offer within 5 days after delivery of the TDS or updated TDS by deposit in mail or email, or 3 days after delivery in person. So I don't want to call it, it's not necessarily a loophole, but if you're making a non-contingent offer, let's just say it's fully non-contingent, and the seller has not provided you the TDS, technically what they are accepting is not a fully non-contingent offer. So if you are on the listing side of a transaction and you are looking to accept an offer that is fully non-contingent, then you want to make sure you deliver that TDS right away. So, and it's actually best practice to have all those disclosures done up front, and you can put them into the MLS if you want. You will get pushback on this, even if you are submitting an offer with investigation contingencies waived, and it may cause your buyer's EMD to remain unreleased in escrow in a dispute status because maybe the other agent doesn't understand how this works. Maybe the seller is upset because they thought they were accepting a non-contingent offer. So again, it takes two parties to release the earnest money, not to cancel, but to release the earnest money. So you may find yourself in an earnest money dispute that the buyer may possibly win, but you have to go and mediate that. Any contingencies waived up front of the RPA will require a second advisory called the NCOA to be signed by the buyer for the transaction file. This is to protect everybody. So what should a seller know before accepting non-contingent offer? If the offer is written as all cash with no loan contingency, the seller should verify the buyer has sufficient funds for down payment or entire purchase price before accepting the offer. If the offer is written without an appraisal contingency in a rapidly rising market, or even a market with increasing inventory and market times, the property may not appraise, and the buyer, even if in breach, may be willing to cancel and risk a dispute with the seller. There's no guarantee a lender will loan, but a fully underwritten, pre-approved buyer is as close as one can get, but there's no guarantee as an all-cash buyer will perform. Buyer may have statutory right to cancel and be entitled to return of any deposit if the seller provides the buyer with TDS after the buyer submits the offer. If the market practice is to deliver the TDS after the offer is received, there may be a little risk and even benefit in allowing the buyer an inspection contingency for the same period that's a statutory cancellation right is in effect. All right, so I have a quick link here that I'll, if you want a copy of this for the TDS law, just for sake of time, I'm going to kind of go past this a little bit, get into a couple other scenarios. My buyer won't remove contingencies prior to the seller making the repairs because they think they will be giving up cancellation right if the seller fails to make the repairs. This one does come up fairly often as well. Once a seller agrees in writing to make repairs, paragraph 15 of the RPA requires the seller to complete the repairs prior to the final verification of condition, which is 5 days prior to close of escrow by default, pursuant to paragraph 3J. It also requires, among other things, that the repairs will be made in a good and skillful manner and comply with applicable law, including governmental permit, inspection, and approval. You'll notice it doesn't state anywhere in here that it has to be done by a licensed contractor. It says that they need to be done in a good and skillful manner. This is an obligation of the contract is not waived by the buyer's removal of contingencies. As the final verification or walkthrough, the buyer has the right to verify that the repairs have been completed as agreed. If not, such failure may possibly constitute a material breach of contract by the seller. Here it is right here, paragraph 16 of the RPA if you want to read it. Paragraph 4A of the request for repairs form RR also states that if there is an agreement on repairs, the buyer agrees to remove the investigation contingency. So it's they're agreeing. If the seller is agreeing, then the buyer is also agreeing. So if the buyer does not remove the contingency, the seller may send a notice to perform and cancel on the buyer, or even though they came to an agreement on repairs. So they could force the buyer to do it. And if the buyer refuses to remove the contingencies, cancel the agreement, move on. I get this one about once a week. The SPBB is gone. So how can I request the seller to pay the buyer's agent's compensation? So last form rollout in December, they removed the form SPBB. The newest RPA revision on 12/24 removed it, and they added it straight into G3. And this is where you now make the request. So we're looking at the grid here. G3, seller's payment of compensation. You still check the box. And then you put in your commission right here. So seller agrees to pay out of transaction proceeds 2% of the final purchase. So just put it right in there. No SPBB anymore. This question comes up quite a bit. Is there a checklist I can use to make sure I give my clients the legally required disclosures? So aside from what we have in pipeline, and the pipeline files, the checklist in there is derived from the car checklist as well. So now obviously we have a general checklist in paperless pipeline because, depending on what the property type is, the type of sale it is, the type of ownership, we can add and subtract some of the stuff that is required on the final. So what is in there is a general checklist. Once you upload the MLS sheet and the CRS, the tax sheet, we, the office, can then see what type of transaction we're dealing with here, and we can modify your checklist accordingly. So that's why we ask for the MLS sheet and the tax sheet, is because we can see what ownership is, and we can see the property type, your build, all that kind of stuff, and we can adjust your checklist right there. But let's say you want to go and learn what they are. Car, legal, has these. These are the links. If you would like to have them, they're on this form. You can use them. It will link you over into car, so you will need to log into car. But here are your checklists if you want to keep this handy. Do I always have to use the broker's name, Rise Realty, in an advertisement? Here's how the legal requirement reads. The responsible broker's identity needs to be in the ad regardless of whether the salesperson includes his or her name or not. So that's a business and professions code. As of January 1st, 2018, agents and brokers are required to include their responsible broker's identity on all solicitation materials intended to be the first point of contact. So I do get this question quite often, when do I have to use the brokerage name? And essentially it's always. Here's how the ethics requirement reads. According to NAR Code of Ethics, the name of the firm must be present in any advertising of real estate services or of property listed with the firm. Therefore, it follows that all realtors' advertisements of real estate services or property listed by the office must contain the office name. All first point of contact solicitation materials must include the name and number of the licensee. This is for both sales agents and broker associates. The responsible broker's identity. This means the name under which the broker is currently licensed by DRE and conducts business in general or is substantial division of the real estate firm. The broker's license number is optional when the name and license number of an agent or broker associate is included. And the status of the agent, such as realtor or agent. Big question that comes up all the time. Do I use Realty Rise Inc. or do I use Rise Realty? You can use either. Realty Rise Inc. is the name of the corporation that is licensed with the DRE. And then we have a fictitious business name called Rise Realty, and that is also registered with the DRE. So you can use either one. What you cannot use is Rise Realty Inc. That is not a thing for us. So it's Realty Rise Inc. or Rise Realty. I prefer you just use Rise Realty. That's the brand that we go by. Why is it spelled backwards in our corporation name? It's a long story, and I can tell that some other day. So, what types of advertising does this apply to? Basically everything. Business cards, stationery, advertising flyers, advertisements on television and print, electronic media, including social media, for sale, open house, lease, rent, or directional signs when any licensee identification information is included. Any other material designed to solicit the creation of a professional relationship between the licensee and a consumer. So we might have a couple questions on that. For the advertisement, does this apply to images or descriptions? Example, can I have an image with my personal logo, but then Rise Realty in the description? Or a broker logo, yeah, first point of contact. So whatever is designed to be first point of contact needs to have it. Can I use a nickname in my advertising for a natural person as opposed to a corporation? A licensee may do so, but only if the nickname is used in place of the first name and the advertising includes the agent's surname or last name as it appears on his or her license, and the advertisement includes the agent's DRE license number if the license number is otherwise required. And we're just about done here. Try to wrap it up quick. So these next two come up quite a bit, and they're pretty important. Do previous defects have to be disclosed if they have already been repaired? The answer is yes. Even if a problem or defect that existed in the past has since been repaired, this is still a material fact and must be disclosed. Problems can reoccur, and buyers should know what to look out for in the future. Section 4 of the SPQ states this in bold font. So this is section 4. This is a snippet from the SPQ, seller property questionnaire. No. So a yes answer, so if you check a box yes, is appropriate no matter how long ago the item being asked about happened or was documented otherwise, unless otherwise specified. So if they've owned the home for 15 years and 1 year into ownership, they had water heater blowout and they put in a new water heater, it needs to be on the SPQ. There is no time limit, is what the state of California is essentially saying here. Furthermore, the seller property questionnaire asks questions specifically about repairs and alterations made to the property. Paragraph 7 of the SPQ asks seller to disclose any alterations, modifications, replacements, improvements, remodeling, or material repairs on the property, as well as in any ongoing maintenance, or if any portion of the property was painted within the past 12 months. There's a snippet here. So actual scenario, city has noted there are violations with the property or building. Seller directly spoke to the city inspector, but a copy was not formally delivered to the seller, and or the incorrect name was on the violation document, but the correct address. Would the seller still be obligated to disclose this if they never received a formal notice from the city and or the notice had the incorrect owner name on the document? This is still a yes. It was told to them. So it needs to be disclosed that, hey, the city came out and said I need to fix these things here, but they didn't provide me a document. But they told me I need to fix these things. The seller needs to relay that to the buyer. Even if they don't have documentation, they need to state what happened there. Or in this scenario, this was a real scenario that happened. The document that came to the seller actually had the wrong name on it. It's still, but the correct property address. still needs to be turned over to the buyer and disclosed. So don't let a technicality land you in court. Still looking at section 6K of the SPQ can be used to address this scenario. This is 6K here. Material facts, even if it was verbal, it's material fact or defects affecting the property not otherwise disclosed to the buyer. Additionally, 11N of the RPA has a provision that the seller agrees to as a term of the purchase, stating they agreed to disclose all known material facts and defects. By agreeing to the terms of the RPA, the seller is agreeing or otherwise binding themselves to the obligation to disclose. Here's section N right here in the RPA. So we want to make sure as listing agents, we are letting them know that the purchase contract itself is binding them to disclose every single thing they know about the home. So what I like to say is the state of California wants the buyer to know everything you know about the home. This is probably about the last one. What do I do about post-closing requests for documents from the opposite party, their agent and or their client? So this is advice from our E&O carrier. This question typically arises after closing when new issues arise, such as newly discovered water intrusion or pest infestation problems that were not disclosed by the seller in the required TDS or mentioned in third-party reports prior to close of escrow. When problems arise after closing, the selling agent usually is contacted by the buyer wanting advice on how to remedy the situation. The vast majority of real estate agents want to help their clients after a problem arises with the purchased property. However, attempting to assist the buyer or seller client with a dispute after closing could place the real estate agent in a situation of getting named in a lawsuit. As a matter of law, a real estate agent's duty to his or her client terminates when the transaction ends. So in California, there's no post-escrow duties owed to one's clients. This was already tried in court. Under civil code, buyers and sellers of real estate are advised that real estate agents are not qualified to give tax or legal advice. As such, a real estate licensee in California has no legal duty to give advice post-closing. Should a California real estate agent ever find themselves in a situation where a client is not happy with the property's purchase post-close of escrow or cancellation of escrow, it is recommended that the licensee do the following. This would be for post-closing complaints. Send an email to the other real estate agent about the client's problem with a request for a written response, and forward the thread to the client with a suggestion that the client consult with an attorney and or third-party expert specific for the client's problem that has been raised. When replying to the client, be sympathetic and understanding in the email, but also state that since the transaction has closed, there's really nothing else that you, the real estate agent or broker, can do because you're not an attorney, licensed contractor, surveyor, small claims advisor, engineer, pest inspector, or some other third-party expert. Save all emails electronically and in hard copy for the future need. Do not volunteer to do anything else for the client post-close or cancellation of escrow other than what is specifically stated above. If the client asks why you cannot do more, simply state under California law, you as the real estate licensee have no legal duty to do anything more than what was recommended other than send your client requested documents from your file. Post-closing document requests should be forwarded to the client. Should the client not have these documents, they can request from you to provide to the other party. And then we're going to end on the flipper disclosures because this comes up a lot. And we have actually a fair amount of you that do property renovations. So this law was effective July 1st of 2024. A seller, or if you're working with investors, you want to make them aware of this. So A seller of a residential 1 to 4 unit property who accepts an offer within 18 months from the date when title is transferred must make the following disclosures. Number one, the seller must disclose repairs and renovations when performed by a contractor with whom the seller entered into contract. Number two, the name of each contractor and their contact information. And three, any permits obtained, or if not obtained, the contact information of third party who can provide the permits. This new law should have little effect on day-to-day purchase practice of realtors. The reason is that first, the seller property questionnaire already requires sellers to meet most of these new disclosure requirements. Secondly, the Standards Forms Advisory Committee is considering changes to the SPQ that will specifically address any new flipper disclosures, obviating any special practice that an agent might otherwise have to adopt. It's an important aspect of disclosure that is part of the transfer disclosure law. This means that disclosure applies to the same circumstances as the TDS. It has the same exemptions as the TDS and is subject to the same cancellation rights as the TDS. So if you have an investor that you're working with that likes to flip properties, make sure they're adding this stuff in and they are fully aware of it so that that doesn't land you in trouble, them in trouble, and the brokerage in trouble because failure to do this could disqualify them from E&O coverage as well. So with even if they have their own coverage, potentially they could be disqualified from coverage on that particular property if they did not disclose the stuff properly. So be aware of all that. Ran a little over today. I'm gonna go through a few questions that are in here. Are we required to get the buyer's agent BRBC for Rise Broker file? No, we are not if you are on the listing side. If the form BRBC they provide is digitally authenticated by the buyers, but there is no authenticated date to go with the signature, is that a valid BRBC? The form is digitally. So they signed it, but they didn't date it. That could be disputable. They're probably trying to skirt the law a little bit, saying, look, we had it signed, but they didn't put the date on there. My assumption is they had it done after the offer. So does Rise Realty logo need to be on advertising such as business card or internet webpage? Yes, on everything. Does person who did repairs need to be a licensed contractor? No, they do not. It just needs to be done in a it was a good and skillful manner. And then I said, all right, and let me check chat real quick. So that was chat, and then anything over in the Q&A? Don't look like it. So hopefully I have some good info for you. Like I said, I like to do these a couple times a year just to kind of share common things that I get questions on every day, every week. So as always, give me a call if you have a scenario. Maybe you'll find your scenario on here. Again, I don't name names. This is just to share with everybody because not everybody goes through the same kind of scenario. So it's stuff that we can all learn from. So yeah, if you ever have any questions, always give me a call, please. Before you get into a sticky situation, I'd rather talk it out before. And hope everybody has a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.